and welcome to Psych Sessions, conversations about teaching and stuff. I'm Eric Landrum along with Garth Neufeld, your podcast hosts. As the name implies, we center on conversations about teaching, but we often veer into other interesting topics, which is the end stuff. This is episode number 110, where Garth had the opportunity to interview Nolan Cabrera from the Department of Educational Policy Studies and Practice at the University of Arizona. Before you hear the interview, please allow me to share some listening tips and some of my favorite moments. This turns out to be a very important and influential interview in the Psych Sessions series. The timing of this perhaps couldn't be better. I believe Nolan and Garth had this conversation after the 2020 presidential election, but before the insurrectionist events in the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. So what's really interesting about that is their conversation actually talks about some of the causes and some of the motivations why some of that might have happened in the Capitol, but obviously it didn't mention that incident specifically because it hadn't happened yet. So that's why I find this conversation really so important, because I think Nolan, because of his research experience and background, the topic that he studies, which is white immunity, is really insightful into understanding not only what's going on our college campuses, getting a better understanding of the world around us, but also might help explain some of the motivation of the events of January of 2021. So the conversation starts off with his research on understanding the usage of the N-word in the campus climate and his surprising research about what happens and where it's used and why it's used. He does his research predominantly focuses on white men, which he calls white guys, which I kind of enjoyed because he kind of goes into it and he explains why he uses that terminology. So he doesn't really study diversity from the experiences of marginalization of the students or faculty, but kind of the causes of it from a whiteness perspective. It's really interesting, the politics of Arizona are fascinating on a number of levels. I think in 2020, the nation got a glimpse of that. And he actually goes into a really detailed story, which is actually quite interesting, about the Tucson Unified School District, the attempts within the state of Arizona and within that school district to remove the Mexican American Studies program. However, there was really great data that was uncovered to demonstrate that it was really quite effective at demonstrating the educational objectives it was set out to achieve. And he actually goes into the kind of the political ramifications of that attempt to remove that program and how it ultimately failed in a court challenge. And so that's kind of related to how Nolan had to establish his credibility in the state, and also kind of the way that people who, when they don't care for an expert and the way he or she is documenting what they do, they will sometimes, attack, well, do you really have the expertise? And this was one of the many methods by which he established his credibility. One of the things that Nolan talked about that were really fascinating that listened for, he talked about really the origins of these racist feelings in white males. And he talks about how sometimes, white males will believe that affirmative action, had these negative effects, and how white males just react really negatively to these perceptions of political correctness. What happens is that he would do studies and find out that, for example, undergraduates at a certain institution would have these negative perceptions of affirmative action at an institution where affirmative action had been abolished 10 years prior to the students ever getting there. And the term that's used in the literature, I don't know if it was Nolan's original term or not, it's called sincere fiction, that these individuals believe in this sincere fiction. And so it's just really interesting to listen to someone who studied this so seriously talk about the applications in the real world. Later on, Garth reveals, that Garth's campus brought him to speak. And so there's also resources available, journal articles that he's published about this topic of white immunity. There's a TED Talk that's available, full-length journal articles. You can find these by by doing the classic searches in Google Scholar and things like that. One of the things that they close their conversation about is that there's a little bit of a concern that the heightened awareness of anti-racism right now, their hopes are that it won't be seen as a fad. It's on people's radar screens right now. And on the one hand, that's a very good thing. And there's hopes that that's leveraged for good. But the other hope is that, it's kind of like that it's not like a diet that you work on it for a while, then it kind of fades away. These beliefs and thoughts about anti-racism have to be worked on by people like me who need to continuously be thinking about this. And you can't just work on it for a couple days and then, consider yourself cured of being a racist. These are things that I know I have to work on continuously for the rest of my adult life. So hopefully, this notion of working on yourself to improve yourself stays in the forefront of the American scene, especially after the events of January 6, 2021. This information and these experts who can tell us about the sources of these attitudes are just more important than ever. And so I'm so thankful that Garth and Nolan had this conversation, and I'm very pleased that Psych Sessions is able to bring this episode to you.
Welcome to the podcast. This is Garth, and I am here today with Dr. Nolan Cabrera from University of Arizona. And as a white guy, Nolan, I feel like I probably messed up your last name pretty good there, but maybe
you were pretty close. It's Nolan Cabrera, so yeah, I mean, you're good. You're good.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Yeah, I need that validation. Anyway, welcome to this conversation, Nolan. And can you just tell us a little bit, like, what's your role over there at the University of Arizona?
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor in the Center for the Study of Higher Education. And what I study there is the racial dynamics on college campuses. But I kind of flip the script on that a little bit because if we say that there's kind of like a diversity problem or a racial problem, implicitly the subject becomes the marginalizations of students of color on campus. And without getting too overly blameful, I want to flip that on its head, because the marginalization of students of color is in effect what's the cause. And so I interview a lot of white guys on college campuses to understand the unconscious habits of race and racism that contextualize and impact our campus climates on a regular basis.
Does that mean that the University of Arizona campus is your laboratory for for conducting this research, and then from there it kind of spills out, or are you involved with? Do you have collaborators that you work with in looking at this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do use the U of A a little bit as a bit of a lab. The one that was really disturbing that a lot of people don't want me to publish on right now, but it's rather germane and important, is just before the election of Trump, I had an almost representative sample of the white guys on the campus who generally either heard or used the N-word on a pretty regular basis and didn't really think there was anything wrong with it. It's probably my most just visceral and raw work that's out there, but that's part of what I do.
All right. So obviously I'm super interested in what you said about controversial research that you did before Trump got elected the first time, the only time.
Yes.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about that. And actually let's back up for a second. I want to tell you kind of who you're speaking to. This is teachers of psychology. We and many people in our society, the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, who just put out an anti-racism statement that is pretty bold. I think is going to have affect a lot of change, hopefully in the future. But these teachers are very motivated. I would say for equality, for equity, and also just for understanding what's going on our college campuses. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you here is because as psychologists, this may not be something that we study as a field. And so one of the reasons I was really grateful that you said yes to coming on the program, is because I feel like we have something to learn from you and from your area of study. And so, and because you do this on college campuses, maybe you can help us really understand the dynamics of what's going on a little more. So with that said, we can kind of go wherever you want today, but of course, I'm interested in this research about white, and was it white males that you were looking at?
Yeah. Almost all of that work that I've done has been on white men, because, and please keep in mind that when I say this, I don't want to give the impression that white women are the perpetuators of racism. It's more a methodological decision, and that is that in earlier pilot interviews, as a fairly obviously externally identified cis man, the interviews with that I would conduct with white men on campus, they would free flow. They would go. There was a lot. They just, I just give them a couple of prompts and they would run with it. The women were a lot more reserved. The conversations did not flow nearly as well. It felt like they were holding back. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And different racial theorists have tried to put have tried to, like Eduardo Bonilla Silva has tried to make the argument that, well, they're just trying to find a more politically correct way to say something, or someone else will say, no, they're just being really thoughtful in their responses. I couldn't make heads or tails out of it. And the cross-gender dynamic made it really really difficult to tease out. So the guys who I interviewed were literally guys. I use that term intentionally. And yeah, it was kind of dramatic after like 3 or 4 interviews. And these guys are talking about, so-and-so said the N-word at dinner the other day, and this and this and this. And they wouldn't even say the N-word. They'd just say it directly. And I'm like, really? Like, you realize I'm recording you right now? And they were fine with it. And a lot of them, like about 2/3 of them would use more of like kind of like the hip hop argument about, the article's entitled "If Lil Wayne Can Say It, Why Can't I?" And it was exactly that. Like, if the rappers are saying with the soft A, Nigga, it's not racist. It's just it's a term of affection. But actually, 1/3 of them would use the N-word with a hard R. And they say, hey, if a guy's acting thuggish and he kind of fits the stereotype, it's totally acceptable. And I'm like, are you serious? Like, and then it was kind of incredible hearing these narratives just constantly coming through, where it was just, and it was weird because very few of them actually thought that there was anything wrong with it, or they wouldn't say overtly they thought there was something wrong with it. But I knew they thought there was something wrong with it because they'd never say it in front of other minority folk. And so their behavior kind of juxtaposed against their belief system. It's like, if there wasn't anything wrong with it, why wouldn't you just say it in front of anybody? So that's kind of what I've been trying to tease out.
Right. So you did put out this out in an article. Then
it's under review right now.
Oh, so it's under
probably
review.
Shouldn't be talking. I shouldn't be talking about it this openly like this.
This will be a few weeks off, so maybe it'll be out by then. But okay, so was this eye-opening to you at the time that this kind of blatant racist talk is going on among white guys on your campus? Was this surprising to you?
Not exactly. So my very first interviews with white guys on campus just occurred maybe about 2006, somewhere in there. And so you had, I've got data, pre-Obama, during Obama, pre-Trump. I don't have anything during Trump, but you can see a really strong trend that the farther along that we go, the stronger that the racial anxiety, overt racial animus, and just overtly racist statements become, the closer and closer and closer that we go, farther that we go through the Obama administration, and the closer that we get to the Trump administration. And I think that kind of mirrors a lot of what we're seeing in society in general right now, where, it was not polite conversation to use overtly racist terms, and now it's actually seeping out a lot into the general discourse.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting that so much of that stuff might have been hidden at that time, and how 4 years has changed things for people to become more emboldened maybe in their use of those terms, and maybe not all of those folks who were in your original study. Do you chalk some of it up to being kind of naive about it, and then some of it to being more like knowingly and consciously racist? I would assume that you would think this is all racism, but that there is kind of a more a more conscious versus passive racism going on.
Yeah, I really struggle with that, because no, there's literally maybe only a handful of guys who I've talked to over the last 15 years who would openly say, yeah, I actually have some racist tendencies. And those tend to be actually extremely leftist progressives who are trying to work through their own racial issues. And the first part of that is identifying it. And so almost to a T, none of these guys think that any of the ones who I was describing earlier, think that there's anything inherently racist with what it is that they're doing. They think it's a joke. They think that it's fun to poke. It's kind of a way of poking the bear of getting over on snowflake liberals. It's a way of just not having to buy into PC culture, which was really, really fascinating, because you want to talk about some really twisted psychology. When I would ask him about political correctness, because that came up constantly. And it was also part of the reason why I think they were so willing to talk to me directly, was that they really felt censored by political correctness. There's this aura of political correctness around our institutions, just oppressive. It means that I can't say what I'm really thinking and feeling. Now, I would ask them, let's pinpoint this. Let's try to, did something happen? Did you get, lit up in class? Did one of your classmates say something inappropriate and the whole thing blew up? And almost to a T, it was just, no, it's just a general feeling that I have. Now, what I find interesting is that at the same time, I've done a lot of side projects looking at the campus climate for, say, like Native students or Latinx students on college campuses. And almost to a T, in the opposite direction, if they're saying, yeah, I experienced some racial hostility, I could say, well, what happened? And they could tell me a direct story about it. Well, I was in my dorm and my roommate asked me if I was illegal and an anchor baby, like something direct like that. This isn't like a kind of I have a feeling about it. It's like real in your face. And these guys, they were living in this imagined world where the political correct police are ready to jump on them at any moment. And then it got really, really twisted, because I interviewed a group of guys at this one academically selective institution, and they were just convinced. They were like, affirmative action almost kept me out. It kept my brother out. My best friend couldn't get in. It does so much harm to people. And affirmative action hadn't been practiced at that institution for more than a decade. They were bent out of shape and pissed off about a program that didn't exist. And that's what's so twisted about the psychology of whiteness on a college campus, is that in many respects, the feelings are real, but the reality just isn't there. It's what Joe Fagan refers to as a sincere fiction. They really sincerely believe this is a reality, but it's completely fictitious in that it doesn't point to any real lived empirical reality. It's just this kind of, well, here we go. And that's what's really frustrating. I think what's been fascinating about the Trump administration coming in is that it feeds off of that almost willful ignorance. It feeds into it. It gives a direction. It gives a target for these all kind of messed up feelings of, I'm not sure what's going on, but it's changing, so it must be bad. And it gives a direction and a target for their feelings of discontent. But the problem is it doesn't reflect any real lived reality. And now we're seeing it on a massive level. I mean, the president, the current president, and a lot of his followers, nope, I won the election. It's like, no, you literally did not. But it's a natural extension off of a lot of this work on whiteness, where it's literally a complete denial of lived reality.
Right. And would you say, and now we brought you onto our campus in September to speak to our faculty just about some of the work that you're doing. So I know that you do a number of different things, but would whiteness be the main area of study that you've been doing over the last, decade? Is that?
Yeah, so I can't stay too long in whiteness because it drives me up a wall. I need to take some time out just for my mental, emotional health. But then the way that I took that time out, the big part of my time was I was deeply involved in fighting back against the state of Arizona banning the highly successful Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, Arizona, and so that took the form of just overt, direct activism, and then also I was the lead statistician in the federal case, and was the only expert witness in the federal case, which actually showed that the banning was unconstitutional because it was both racist and politically motivated. I was the only one of 4 expert witnesses total. I was the only one to be testifying against the state who employed him. So, that was my break from whiteness.
Okay, so for those of us who don't know about that case and what went on, what can you summarize what was going on? Because I think we're all reminded right now with the election that has just passed that Arizona is a very interesting state right now. So maybe fill us in on that.
Sure. So back in 2010. The state of Arizona passed a law, HR 4437, which gave the state superintendent of public instruction the unilateral authority to be able to withhold state funding to school districts if he found that they had classes that promoted the overthrow of the U.S. government, promoted racial resentment, didn't treated students as groups instead of as individuals, and tailored classes only to a specific group of students. And on their surface, these were not controversial premises, but and this is by the guy's name is Tom Horn, by his own rationale. He wanted to eliminate the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson. And so at the time, this was the biggest and most robust ethnic studies program in a K-12 environment in the entire country. And as I was able to later demonstrate through some logistic regression, actually a lot of logistic regression, was that it was one of the most effective in the entire country, but he wanted to eliminate it because he kept saying it was un-American to have race-forward classes. He also felt disrespected because the labor leader, Dolores Huerta, was talking to students in Tucson High, and she said, because of their legislative agenda, Republicans hate Latinos. And so he had his deputy superintendent, Margaret Garcia Dugan, go talk and give a rebuttal saying, I, as a Latino, the Republicans don't hate Latinos. And the students in the Mexican American Studies, or a bunch of students, just they weren't allowed not to be at the. Attendance was mandatory at this assembly, and they weren't allowed to ask any questions. So instead, what they did is they were, a lot of them were wearing these overshirts. They took those off, and under they had these white shirts that said, "You can silence my voice, but not my spirit," and then symbolically put painter's tape over their mouth. And Tom Horn lost it. He was like, "This is the most disrespectful I've ever seen children in my 30 years as an educator." He's not an educator; he's a lawyer. And also, like, that's like one of the least disrespectful pushbacks I've ever seen of students. Like, so obviously he's never been in that classroom before. But the point being that he had a personal vendetta for a long time, and also thought that as the more that he played this idea out about banning the Mexican American Studies program, the more it really played with the state of Arizona. I mean, it was deep, deep, deep red at that point. We had SB 1070, the anti-immigrant law. We had just banned affirmative action. I mean, it was ripe for the pickings. And some people had rumored that he was going to use this as a jumping off point to try to run for governor of the state. So anyway, a couple of years later, through a lot of litigation, the district folds and actually bans the program, but there's still a lawsuit pending that claimed that the ban was unconstitutional on both freedom of speech and equal protection grounds. And it went up to the Ninth Circuit. It went to a federal court, a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then back down to the federal court. And in the summer of 2017, it was all hands on deck. Here we go. Here's our one shot. We all came out. We had just, everybody was ready. A big law firm took up our case pro bono, and we just knocked it. Like, we didn't know at the time that it was going to be such an overwhelming victory, but when the ruling came down, it was unequivocal. Like, the state could have appealed it to the next higher court, but they were like, "Why? There's so little room for appeal in this." They just got slammed in the for basically their racism and partisan politics that they were playing. But the biggest problem was that this extraordinarily highly successful Mexican American Studies program in a low-income Title I barrio district in South Tucson, or in Southern Arizona, this beautiful program got eliminated, and so many lives were harmed in the process for this political posturing. So that's that's a 7-minute summary of about 10 years of protracted struggle against the state that was zeroing in on a particular program.
Did you think that you would, and thanks for that, by the way, did you think that you were going to be doing advocacy work like this when you were doing, let me get this straight, you did your undergraduate at Stanford, right? Your undergraduate degree at Stanford, and then did you do your PhD at UCLA?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So when you were studying, and maybe we'll get into those programs a little bit more, but did you see this as, did you see yourself as a researcher, or did you see yourself in these advocacy roles? What was your goal? And then how did you land here? And are you happy to be playing this role? Because I know that you, even in, now, as you are speaking to faculty, I assume other groups as well, about all of these things, you really have become an advocate.
Yeah, I don't think I ever stopped being an advocate, in the sense that, my dad either says that I'm an incredible troublemaker or that trouble finds me. I'm not quite sure what it is, but no matter where I have been, there's always been some major thing going on. Like, literally the first year that I started graduate school was when did I screw up the numbers? I think I might have screwed up the numbers earlier, but the Sensenbrenner bill in Congress basically was SB 1070. On a national level, massively anti-immigrant. And this is like, I'm starting my graduate work. And that's when there was all the organizing that shut down major cities, and LA was the largest one of them. And so, here I am, first year doc student, my professor's telling me you need to focus on your studies. And I'm like, yeah, I'm doing actually pretty well in my studies, but I also need to be down here, marching with the people while this is happening. And I didn't really anticipate I moved out to Arizona in 2008. And I didn't anticipate that things were going to get as hairy as they were. But I was immediately involved in some way, shape, or form, even if it's, and as folks learned about my methodological training and in grad school, they found very specific roles for me within. They found very specific roles for me within the larger movement, and so. I there are some times where I can separate those, where I'm like, yeah, I'm just doing it. I'm doing more of just I don't like the idea of pure scholarship. I think it should have at least some relevance in some way to the real lives of people. But there's sometimes where I'm doing more, less advocacy and more scholarship. But the lines for me have always been really blurry. I never, in the wildest dreams, thought that I was going to be involved in something in this kind of high profile. Of a controversy. I'm really glad that I was able to be part of it. But it's one of these things that there's some long lasting effects that stick with folks who have that kind of sustained commitment. You can see even now, a couple years after the ruling came down, and I'm including myself in this group, we're still worn down. We don't have the same, giddy up in our step that we did, 2010, 2011, 2012. But in many respects, I've always wanted to be able to leverage the scholarly work for advocacy, but I also need to make sure that advocacy doesn't overwhelm the need to do rigorous, methodologically rigorous work in the process, because there's always that temptation to, cut corners for the larger cause. And actually, I had to have a really honest conversation with the director of the program when I was commissioned to do this initial work about the numbers. I said, look, we all know that when programs get scaled up, they tend to lose efficacy. And I'll set up my regression models with the proper specifications, but when I hit return, there's no guarantee how these numbers are going to come down. And are you prepared? Like, I can't sacrifice my career to be that kind of advocate. Are you prepared just to let the numbers fall where they may? Guys were like, absolutely, here we go. And yeah, that was it. They happened to come down in the way that in favor of the program, but those are always the perpetual tensions with this kind of work.
Yeah, that's the ethics of it, I guess. When you're marrying advocacy and research together. There's also this theme too that you talked about sincere fiction, and you cut out a little bit when a few minutes ago when we were talking about it, at least on my end. But sincere fiction, I think, can happen on every side, right? When people are uninformed, it seems to me like one of the greatest gifts that we can give our students these days is critical thinking skills, and also just research literacy skills to figure out what is true out there. Because I think that even on your end, there are people, or like on the advocacy end of things, there are people who just want to believe in something very sincerely, and maybe are not as concerned with the data.
Well, I mean, a classic example of that is that in the 80s, in a lot of urban districts, some very progressive communities of color were like, look, you have continually failed our students. We need charter schools to exercise more local control. And it was actually more of a progressive, instead of the way that we think about it as more of a right-wing idea right now. And then the data came out and folks were like, oh, wait, that was a good idea in theory. In practice, it just doesn't work. It doesn't have any of the impacts that people thought. But you're right that there's some folks who are just ideologically driven, that, this is the hill that I'm going to die on. Like, and there's no arguing against some folks who are so dug in, but that doesn't mean that the facts are irrelevant, because we're not, when you're talking about advocacy, you're not trying to convince, you're not going to be able to convince everybody, and different people will be persuaded by different forms of argument. And so some people actually find the numbers really compelling. Some people, like Tom Horn, the former state superintendent of public instruction here in Arizona, he literally said that the numbers were completely irrelevant. Like, most biggest educational controversy in the state, he said specifically, it doesn't matter if these kids are learning more, because he was convinced that Mexican American studies was racist. And there was sort of a subtext of it's racist against white people.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And that must be a common pushback you get in your work. Would you say?
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I wrote a very benign piece for The Conversation. Yes, shameless plug. But recently about the Cal State system offering ethnic studies requirements, and so I wrote a little 800-word piece about ethnic studies. It has a lot of potential if done well, but here's some predictable pushback that you'll get from largely white students. Be prepared, but still advocate. Very benign. Man, the comment section, you racist, communist, fascist bastard, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it is interesting how quickly critics are to jump on the racist accusation doing this work, because in some respects, it's almost as if, like, I went to the doctor says I have cancer, and then I get mad at the doctor for giving me the bad news, as if his information caused me to be sick. And there's a lot of that misplaced rage in this work, where folks think that by diagnosing racism within society, that in some way I'm contributing to it, and that only makes the situation worse. It's basically doubling down on racism and distracting from the core problem.
Yeah, it makes me think about how our country sees expertise right now. I mean, we see it in public health, the questioning of expertise, but also I'm hearing it in your field as well, where you have the experts who are saying these things, and then anybody who considers themselves, even an interested party, in those comment sections, maybe two things. Maybe they don't consider themselves experts, or maybe they do, but they don't recognize expertise. And when somebody with a whole career of experience writes a pretty non-threatening 800-word article, and they feel like immediately, because they disagree with it, that it's not relevant. I find that a really fascinating phenomenon that we're dealing with right now.
Absolutely. But I think we do need to separate out the two issues just a little bit, in the sense that, so like when I talk to, my friends and colleagues over in public health, and just the complete misinformation from somebody like Jenny McCarthy on vaccines just drives them up a wall. Like, it's like, this is so stupid. And it's not just stupid, but there's a certain arrogance that comes with it, because in third world countries where a lot of folks are where they don't have nearly the educational system that we have here, folks aren't rebelling against vaccines because they know, like, this stuff can kill you. It's not an abstraction. And so it's not necessarily just about being educated, but there's something about this insulary arrogance and pushback against expertise that especially folks in public health, but folks in climate change and different things like that are getting. There's this additional layer, though, when it comes to my work, where there's just a complete avoidance of trying to even meaningfully engage issues of race. Like these folks have been fed this nonsense that, oh yeah, Dr. King had a dream that we should all be treated equal, and it's a colorblind approach, and anything less is racist. And they don't want to feel uncomfortable. They don't want to feel. They don't want to feel like they have any, like, oh, I'm not a racist person. Like a lot of these things have a lot of white defensiveness around issues of race stems from a desire to see themselves as a non-racist good person. And it's funny because sometimes for me, expertise doesn't even come into the equation. Like a lot of my colleagues who are more in the, sciences and applied fields, like you said, in public health, they'll have their credentials questioned, or do you have an alternative motivation? For me, it's just, dude, you're a racist ass, and I hope that you don't survive past the Trump election. I mean, the expertise doesn't even become a relevant factor.
Interesting.
In that, and so there are some times where it will get to more of an expertise area, but they tend to be in a more isolated incidents. Like the bulk of it doesn't really engage in any meaningful, not even academic discussion, but just anything that even engages the issue. Like literally the emails I've been receiving about this not silly, I actually really like the piece, but the emails I've been receiving off of it are just ridiculous. You're Stalinist, Leninist, want to take over our mind control, misquoting George Orwell, and I mean, it's every hackneyed playbook. I even had one guy. This was a different incident a couple of years ago, where I was saying that I made a comment on Fox News that homophobia is inappropriate because that's a really controversial premise. And this guy called me up and left this long voicemail about, you're really smart, but scripture is true, and you would know that if you really studied, but maybe it's your ponytail is pulled too tight to think straight. And I was like, well, all right, here we go. That's like, if we were on the playground, that was a good one. That was well played, you son of a gun. And sometimes I don't want to take I don't want to downplay the severity and the kind of the caution that I have to play around the haters, but sometimes I have to laugh at it because it's like, really, wow, we're 12 years old again. Should we start telling your mama jokes now and like going back and forth like that? I mean, is that really where the level of political discourse is right now?
You seem really like, I don't know you well, but you seem kind of even keeled. When does this stuff upset you, or is that long gone?
You got to remember, man. I grew up in McMinnville, Oregon, in the late '80s, early '90s. It was a pretty overtly racist place, and I think that that did help me develop a thick skin for a lot of the pushback that I get publicly. Because a lot of times it's really easy to it's really easy to dismiss the trolls. Like I just, someone trolls me on Twitter or whatever, they always say, don't feed the trolls, don't feed the trolls. And I'll either ignore them, or sometimes I'll just be a smart aleck to them, but not take them really seriously. I think the thing that's really having said that, there is one area that really does get me bent out of shape right now, and that is when people who are really, really close to me, who I dearly care about, love, and have a great deal of affection for, can just go so deeply. It can so just full steam ahead, go off the deep end, in particular with Trumpism, but all of the racial things that go along with it. And it breaks me up a lot more because I'm having to make some very I'm having to make some very difficult decisions about, do I really want a lot of these folks in my life? Because they just don't, their presence is just so overtly toxic and so taxing on me emotionally. Can I do this? And the short answer of it is no. And so I've been going through a lot of kind of like mini mourning periods. It's weird because my mom can even point it out, like the 5 stages of grief, and you're in the angry stage, you're in the denial stage, you're like that's. But I think that been emotionally a big part of what I've been having to deal with in this time, but that one does hurt, because those are relationships that I cherish these are like 20, 30 year long friendships that are just disintegrating before my eyes. And there is a certain amount of mourning that goes along with that.
Yeah. You mentioned Twitter. I follow you on Twitter, and I do see that as a place where you really don't hold back. There are some times where I see a tweet come through and I'm like, oh, Nolan's being real honest here. And so how has Twitter treated you? Because Twitter seems to be that space where you get a lot of haters. And what's been your approach to Twitter?
Yeah. So I try to elevate the voices where we're really having a meaningful conversation, and just shut out and ignore the ones where we're not. Like, if you're coming at me hard and trying to say, of course, like, oh, you libtard professor or whatever, that, it's like, we're not going anywhere. Why are you doing this? Right. And these folks, they can't, a lot of them can't do anything substantive. They don't have, they're just angry folk with, 10 friends trying to have their opinion validated. I'm not going to give them that nonsense. Like I said, sometimes there are occasions where I feel like a smart aleck and, respond like, oh, dear little troll, don't you have a bridge to, and some Billy Goat's gruff to go stalk or something like that. But usually it's not worth my time and attention. And honestly, like, the haters are there. You just generally don't engage them. It's not that hard. I don't quite understand why. When the haters get threatening, that can be scary. But that doesn't happen nearly as often as people just calling you names and doing stuff like that. And it's like, those are folks who I don't know they could be wherever, who knows? They just, and they're dedicating their lives to just hating. Like, that's a sad existence. And I think the more that I keep reminding myself about that, the more that I can really focus on, what's important in these conversations, because there are important conversations to be had on Twitter. And like you said, I don't hold back. I try to be pretty direct and, upfront about what I'm thinking, what I'm working on, how I'm processing some stuff. And I think that it's, an incredibly important medium that's extraordinarily difficult to navigate. But overall, it's, generally speaking, just don't feed the trolls. You're going to be usually pretty okay.
Yeah. Well, hey, we've got about 10 minutes left. I told you I'd only keep you for an hour. So we got about 10 minutes left. And I want to know, what are, I'm guessing you're doing a lot of speaking this year. This has been a really interesting year. It's almost like, everything you did before this year has probably kind of put you in this position to speak to some of these issues that that we're all aware of that are going on around our country. So what are you being invited to speak about the most these days, particularly to faculty and institutions?
Generally speaking, this has completely caught me off guard. But I developed a concept called white immunity, which is sort of my development over white privilege. But instead, it's not an extraordinarily difficult concept. It's pretty straightforward. All that it says is, instead of whiteness elevating white people and sort of the mental model of privilege and an elevated aristocratic life, that it's saying that whiteness provides for white people more of a social inoculation to the disparate treatment that racial and ethnic minorities receive on a regular basis. So it's more that it prevents them from receiving these negative effects of racism that folks of color experience on a regular. And when I wrote that back in maybe 2017, something like that, I was like, okay, cool, doing a little riff on Peggy McIntosh, that'll work. And for some reason, I have my feelings about why it is, but it's been easily the number one talk that I've been asked to give, whether it's nationally, locally, anything like that. But it seems to, I think that number one, it is basic, which lends itself to sort of why it is that we're in this position right now. That we haven't made as much racial progress as we would like to think. And so a lot of us are still at these really 101 levels when we actually need to be a lot more advanced. I think the other part is that it actually pedagogically brings down a little bit of the defensiveness, because the white privilege conversations are continually disrupted, where folks are like, well, my family struggled in blah, 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 blah way. How can you say we're privileged? When in fact, this one just says, no, what I want you to consider is empathetically how you're connected to people of color and what's happening to them that's not happening to you. Explore that difference, but don't center the white body in the process. Because so many of the white privilege conversations were exactly that. I have white privilege because I can find a Band-Aid in my own skin color. I have white privilege because I have white privilege. And it continually was white people talking about themselves. White immunity instead says, well, communities of color are hurting in these different ways. Let me explore that. What's my moral, ethical responsibility to learn across these differences? And so it opens up a lot more dialogue and actually creates a lot more of an impetus to learn and grow when folks have the opportunities to do that. And so that's been the number one talk that I've been giving, and it's like by a lot. It's not even close. I mean, I give close to maybe 50 lectures a year, and I'd say almost 60% of them are somewhere around in some way related to white immunity.
Yeah. Well, even just hearing you talk about that, and that was your TEDx talk was on white immunity as well, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, great. And have you written about it, and are you writing about it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a full length article that goes through the nuances of white immunity, and then it's a theoretical core of the book, White Guys on Campus. And so, yeah, I've worked through it, applied it, done it in a lot of different ways. And I think what was strange for me, though, is that, like just before or just after White Immunity was published, I put together this piece with a grad student of mine named Chris Corses Zimmerman on white male ignorance and how it affects their racial ignorance affects the campus climate. And this was a really deep exploration, theoretically, methodologically rigorous, all this stuff. Really proud of that. God, no one's read it. It didn't pick up at all. Like we were kind of like, yeah, we did this. And then here's kind of this little, oh yeah, I've been thinking about Peggy McIntosh a little bit. And here's kind of this basic thing. And it took off. The month that the journal published that piece, it was, I think, the most downloaded piece of that month. And I mean, it's just, it befuddles me how I mean, these are things you can't control, because I guess maybe I misread my audience or something, but yeah, yeah. So there's been some writing about white immunity out there.
Yeah. So what's the title of that article, and where can people find it?
The white immunity one?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay. So it is white immunity, working through the pedagogical pitfalls of privilege. And it is published. I'm sorry, I want to make sure that I always screw up the name of this journal, so I wanted to get it right for you. But it's the Journal for NCORE, which is it's a really long title. So I want to
no worries.
Yes. So the Journal Committed to Social Change on Race and Ethnicity. So back in 2017.
Cool. So yeah, folks can find that there. When you see college campuses these days, and I'm always hesitant to ask, a person of color to solve problems for white people. I'm very aware that is that's something that is quite exhausting for people of color, and yet I wonder if it would be okay for me to ask you this, because you put yourself in this position of educating folks like me and people in higher education. Do you have any practical steps for those of us who are trying to figure out what can we do? What kinds of self-reflection can we do? What kinds of reading? What kinds of engagement with students or across campus or in policy or whatever? Where can we be most effective at jumping in if this is something that we want to address and change? And particularly, I'm talking about racist or white supremacist practices in college campuses.
Absolutely. So I like the way that you started off that conversation about, what can I do on myself? And that's, a lot of people have been doing some really deep work about that. Not just saying, oh, hey, here was a reading list that Ibram X. Kendi put out, and, I got through it, so now I'm not racist, but like actual doing a lot of that self-work in the way that you would almost think about it in terms of like going to therapy, but really committed to improving yourself as a person and non-defensively working through your own racial bias and racial issues. Now, that's a great starting point, but it's not enough. And so the next, I guess the big thing is, first and foremost, there needs to be a commitment for a long term. It can't be this one and done. It can't be, it needs to be perpetual engagement with an issue. And the sort of corollary that I use with that is, January 1st comes along, I need to go on a diet. I do a crash diet. A week later, it's over. A lot of people have been crash dieting anti-racism, and it's not effective. Like, just stop doing that, because all you're going to do is make yourself feel good, but you're not going to be doing the good work. This is, months, years of learning about this, engaging in it. And there are plenty of resources to do this. The next step, though, and this is what's really difficult, but so critically important in institutions of higher education, is understanding and taking an inventory of how it is that we might be perpetuating racist practices on campus. And a lot of folks are like, well, we don't really exclude folk of color from participating. Well, in some ways you kind of do. And, or you might be privileging white people unintentionally. So a classic example is in the tenure process, that it's pretty well recognized that folk of color tend to have a lot heavier advising loads than white folk. They tend to do a lot more applied work and community-oriented work that may not necessarily be as valued in the promotion and tenure process. And a lot of the sort of, you have the flagship journal for every field. And the rankings of said journals frequently prioritize ones that have historically supported white scholars over scholars of color, and more of the quote unquote niche journals tend to be populated by a lot of, or be supported by a lot of scholars of color in their work. So, just with that one issue, there's race built into each one of those criteria for promotion and tenure, even though it's not explicitly stated. And so then the question becomes, what would an institutional policy look like that actually promoted greater racial equity along those lines? So pragmatically, at the U of A, like a few years back, they made a point of having applied scholarships that actually counting as scholarship and saying like, no, this work should be in your dossier. It should count. It should do all those things. And that's really important. It's not enough. It needs to be in conjunction with a lot of different issues. There's always a need to diversify the faculty, but you don't want to just bring in that one person to be the solo token representative. You want to make sure that, for example, utilize things like a cluster hire around a specific issue where you'll bring in a critical mass of folk of color so that they can continue to support each other in the process. Make sure that deans, department heads, administrators, provosts, that part of their, and not just like a cute little checkup, but a really core component of their performance reviews are about how much are they promoting diversity on campus? How have they supported and retained faculty of color within their division or within their college? I mean, there's 1,001 ways, and I'm literally just riffing off the top of my head, but there's 1,001 ways that you can do this. And the point being that I love the way that my former department head, Gary Rhodes, talks about this. Everything is negotiable. Just because a policy is the way that it is right now doesn't mean it has to be that way in perpetuity. But we have to have the creative imagination to think about, what could we do differently? Because there's an old line in higher education scholarship that we frequently incentivize bad behavior. And it's really true. It's like, you wonder why a lot of higher education scholars are not excellent teachers. Well, because we are not trained in that area, and we're evaluated on the bulk of it is based upon our scholarship. So the incentive is to go in that direction. The question then becomes, what would it look like to incentivize good behavior? What would we need to do that? So in order to do that, we have to A, identify what good behavior is, and then B, figure out how to push people in that direction. How do we create the whole sticks and carrots that will actually get people to move in that direction? And that's a long process, but that's where you take the personal responsibility around anti-racism on the individual and take it up to a structural organizational level. And that's where huge change can be made.
Yeah, that's loud and clear in what you're saying. And I just want to remark about what you first said, which is that anti-racism, if we're not careful, and it probably is a crash diet for folks, because it has come up at such a politically charged time. Call for the George Floyd death, the Black Lives Matter movement, all these really important things that have happened in the last year have really led to a lot of institutions to think about who they are and what they're doing, and to even put some things in place. But I am wondering, and I think what I feel is that this could blow over, and then what that was just a fad for institutions rather than long-term change, which it sounds like that's what you're cautioning us toward.
Absolutely. And it's I do think though that it's okay to leverage this specific historical point in time, because there are people who are going to be fair weather fans who are going to jump onto the bandwagon right now, the same way that right now everybody is a Dodgers fan because they won the World Series. It's like, yeah, good for you. And it will fade out. But I think that there is energy behind this work that I haven't really seen in my academic career to this point. And with that, and with this weird kind of destabilization that's been going on, that also means that there's a lot of opportunity for change. Not necessarily saying that it will or will not happen, but that there's the prospect of it. But it takes deep level commitments and people to really follow through on that in the long run. But for all of the stress that we've all been under for so long, this for me is an incredibly hopeful time in that sense that there is possibility. But I just caution a lot of folk against falling too much into the trap of misinterpreting Dr. King's words, where he said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it always bends towards justice. And that's the one area that I kind of disagree with him on, because I think that it's not that it does bend towards justice, it's that we bend it towards justice. And so then the question becomes, how do we collectively leverage our power to move in that direction during the specific historical point in time? Because it's probably, these openings, these opportunities to restructure our institutions, it's not going to come, they don't come along very often. And what are we going to do in this moment? Because it's going to tighten back up. We're going to go back to the some sort of a status quo, whatever that is. And it'll be a lot harder to advocate for change at that point.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about that. And it was a great way to finish. And what you were suggesting to us off the top of your head for practical things that an institution could do to enact structural changes, well, that might be off the top of your head. I think many of those things don't necessarily occur to folks like me, people who have maybe that white immunity. And so any of that, I hope that you write about it. I hope you continue to challenge us to think through those things. And Nolan, just best of luck as you continue on in your advocacy work and your scholarship as well, to affect really important change in our communities and our institutions of higher education. So again, thanks for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for having me and opening up this space, and also thanks for cultivating this space. So I hope I said some stuff that stuck with you and your listeners. So appreciate it.
Thanks.